All the news coverage of the Titan sub tragedy, I thought it would be an opportune time, an appropriate time to talk about something that I've always kind of been familiar with, and it's my personal connections to the Titanic. Um, Now, just caveat here, this isn't going to be one of those sort of things where, people jump on a bandwagon, something akin to that. Like, we get it with famous events. Where people say, I was there on the day, and it's, you know, it may or may not be true, but sometimes there's a sense that, well, so was everyone kind of thing. And I don't want to exaggerate my connections here. I don't want to say something that's not. So, for example, I didn't know any passengers. I've no connection in that sense. More kind of a synchronicity, a sort of coincidental connection. But nevertheless, it's definitely been something that I've always been aware of. I'm just kind of positioning my laptop here. Um, that's quite right, actually. Now, my whole life I've been interested in the story of the Titanic. And actually, in my immediate vicinity, I've just been watching clips of the film. It's my favorite film, but this video is not about the James Cameron film. But I've got the special edition. I've got my Titanic mug behind me. You could see little model that's from the Titanic Museum or the Titanic Court in Belfast from my parents. I have the old novel. It's fallen apart a bit, but Race the Titanic. What else? Yeah, and of course the newspaper headline here. This is from the Titan tragedy. From the Daily Mail. Thought this was poignant. The Titanic claims 5 more lives. The report is by Inderdeep Baines. Thought that was striking. The Daily Express had a similar headline. The Titanic claims 5 more lives. Now, before I get into my connections with the ship, just a quick word on this. Uh, there's now been revelations that apparently safety warnings were ignored, and there was apparently an email exchange between Stockton Rush, who was the expedition chief, and um, and someone else involved in the industry. I have to say, it doesn't look good. It does look like there was a stubborn sort of push ahead with this, with a cavalier approach to safety. The sad thing is, the young guy, the youngest victim, Suleiman, the son um, of one of the other passengers, was apparently terrified. Now, I don't know if that was just his youth or if it was kind of a foreboding about the safety issue. I don't know what it was, but it's tragic to think that he was indeed terrified when this happened. Um, there's talk about bringing them up. I don't know. Firstly, I think it would be very hard to find them. Secondly, there is an argument that they should lie there. It's kind of a similar argument for not raising the Titanic itself. It's a grave. I mean, you wouldn't go to the Battle of the Somme and build a theme park. It just wouldn't be. There's something sacred about the site, and I think that should be respected. I also think this disaster might well really change the industry. Maybe 111 years on, maybe it's time to just give it a rest. It's one thing, exploring the wreck, but it's really been extensively explored. I mean, there's other shipwrecks out there. I'm not actually in principle opposed to it. I think there are scientific values and I think there's cultural values in maritime exploration of shipwrecks. It should always be done in a respectful way, particularly when you're talking about World War II shipwrecks, World War I shipwrecks, and tragedies like the Titanic, the Lusitania. Um, on the subject of shipwrecks, there is none that come even close to the fame of the Titanic. Off the top of my head, there's the Lusitania. There's actually the worst, the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was a German ship torpedoed by the Soviets. But none come even close to the Titanic in terms of fame. There's the Indianapolis, the Arizona, some of those World War II wrecks are quite famous, but again, not on the same level. And I think it's because this has been said before. It's the end of the Gilded Age. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was it was symbolic of an age. Anyway, to the point of this video, I'm 37. I was born on the 1st of September 1985. The 1st of September 1985. Now that happens to be the very day. I don't mean the week, I don't mean the month, I mean the very day that Robert Ballard discovered it at the bottom of the North Atlantic. Very day. A few years ago, my parents got me a back copy of the Times. They couldn't get the exact day, but I think it was the 2nd of September, and it covered that story. Well, actually, that was the right edition, because it's always the following day that covers the story. Um, but that's a little bit. That's one thing. Um, the other thing is, I was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. At that time, Ireland. Well, actually, no, 1985. Crossing my wires there when the Titanic was built. It was Ireland. But yeah, so I was born on the day it was rediscovered at the bottom of the Atlantic in the city where it was built. Now, there were other people born in Belfast that day, probably not very many. They've got that same coincidence. I believe it was either my great great grandfather or my great great uncle. I'm not sure which. I'll need to double check that with my dad, but one of them worked at Harland and Wolff shipyards, and he was a foreman, and he may well have worked on the Titanic. I'm not 100% sure about that, but given the time frame, it's highly likely. There were 20,000 men at that shipyard, so it's very plausible. Um, at one point, we thought that Thomas Andrews, the architect of the Titanic, he's played by Victor Garber in the film. We thought that he lived in the same house as my grandparents. It turned out that actually there'd been a number change at some point, so unfortunately it wasn't exactly the same house. They ran a successful bed and breakfast in Belfast, the Ash Rowan. They passed away in the late 2010s, but they were in the hospitality industry, and they ran this bed and breakfast. Um, and they've had quite prominent guests there. I believe James Cameron may have stayed. Again, I can't be 100% sure about that. Presumably when he was researching the film. Um, but yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't exactly the same building, but it was the same street. Andrews lived in that very street, Windsor Avenue in Belfast. So yeah, that's my Titanic connection. So when I look at the footage from 1985, I'm thinking, yeah, it's my birthday, literally my birthday. So I've always felt that connection. The film, and I won't go into too many personal details here because it is very personal, but it's my favorite film. But I remember former girlfriend that I had. We watched it together, and she had sort of an auburn streak. I'm not saying she looked like Kate Winslet, but I kind of nicknamed her my rose at the time. It was, yeah, just a little romantic thing. And we watched a movie, and it was, yeah. Anyway, I'll close this. Will interest in the Titanic fade? I don't think it ever will. I don't think it ever will. There'll be something else that will happen that's connected to this ship. Something is found, or and maybe there'll be a period of hiatus where after this story it kind of goes back to. There is a moral question whether there should be further exploration. Definitely, there will have to be safety standards looked at. I mean, it's an irony that over a century on, it's the very same thing. It's sort of a hubris of safety warnings were ignored, and it's the arrogance of man. I don't want to be too harsh on Stockton Rush. I mean, it sounds cold to sort of criticize a man who's just died, but it sounds like the war warnings ignored, and I think Ocean Gate is going to face some legal actions. But the industry should not ignore that stuff. It's not trivial. How many disasters, how many tragedies could have been prevented by safety warnings being heeded? And it's just another example. One final thing. There is a debate about, these guys were wealthy. There's several navies involved. It was a huge operation. Is there a discrepancy between the response to this and the response to that much bigger disaster in the J&C last week, 2 weeks ago, the migrant boat? Well, that got coverage because of its scale, but I think it is fair to say there is a discrepancy. I mean, There's no way to gloss it over the way that one disaster's been covered with 700 victims potentially versus a disaster with 5 victims. Different. There's no getting away from that. I think the difference, so and I mentioned this in the last video, but I got a phone call at the time. I think the difference is that there has been other tragedies in the Mediterranean related to that subject. So in a way, it's just the worst for a while of many. There were two disasters in 2015, I think, claimed more victims, but it will hopefully reiterate the debate about this human tragedy. Desperate people making this journey across the Mediterranean and the Aegean. No one has a magic wand about this. I do think that there needs to be very harsh penalties for people traffickers. I think it's evil. But there's always going to be a blame game. Clearly, we can't have an open door policy on migration, but whatever people think of it, there were 100 children in that hull. Apparently, there were 100 children. Whatever people think of this issue, it should never get to a point where it's desensitized and people forget they're human beings. I've heard people talking about the subject in quite callous ways. I can never endorse that. Um, and I'm conservative on immigration. We need controls, but it's a major tragedy. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. That's my Titanic connections. Um, Proud might not be the right word, because it's not from a personal achievement, but it's interesting for me, and it's something that it's just poignant because it is a connection for me. So, I'll tell you what, in the comments, let me know if you have any connection to a famous event or a famous thing, or the Titanic for that matter. Anyone from Liverpool, Southampton, Cherbourg? Maybe you have some Titanic connection. I mean, obviously it's closely linked to Belfast because that's where the ship was built, but most of the crew were from Southampton. It was registered in Liverpool. There was a French connection, so the Titanic's quite international in that sense. And of course, it was going to New York City, and then St. John's in Canada. Most of the victims were buried there, so there's a lot of places that have Titanic connections. Maybe none more though, more so than Belfast because it was built there, but certainly the other cities I think have those connections. Um, but like I say, there's been worse shipwrecks since the Titanic. The Wilhelm Gustloff, about 9,000 people perished. Far bigger toll than the Titanic. Um, but it will always be symbolic of that age. I mean, even in modern times, the MV Jula, it was a vessel that sank off the coast of Senegal in 2002. Who remembers that? Almost 2,000 victims, worse than the Titanic. Who remembers it? Um, Kind of sad that, in a way. I mean, there'll never be an epic film about the Jula, but I don't know, maybe there's just something in that, in the sense that the Titanic's symbolic of other things. So it is a tragedy in itself, but it's symbolic of an era. I mean, had the Titanic happened in wartime, I don't think it would be as famous. Let me know your thoughts.